Hey folks, welcome to a special No Holds Bar MLK Day episode of the Political Education for Freedom podcast. I'm Nitra, and today we're diving into the raw, unfiltered side of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. We're talking about his real thoughts on white supremacy, white dominance, and yes, even white liberals. Yeah, we've been hearing that a lot, right? Well, buckle up. It's going to get a little controversial, but that's okay. We can do this, right? We always do. So, we all know Dr. King for I Have a Dream, right? Yeah, I know we do because I teach it. It's actually one of the, I think that's one of the only speeches actually that is recorded in the textbooks. Even the way they structure the books when they discuss MLK, it's like MLK, I Have a Dream. It's like the two are inseparable. We all know the former congressman, now ancestor, John Lewis, who passed. Latest book was Good Trouble. We know he was there. He was very young. He spoke at the march. There were other people slated to speak, but they didn't. And that was for all sorts of different reasons, mainly optics, politics. The administration at the time gave a lot of pushback on what would be said at the march. They wanted it to be violent so that they can react. One of the things I talked about in one of the episodes, I talked about the ideology of white supremacy and how it affects the mental makeup of white people because they've bought into white supremacy. And that's been going back since before Martin Luther King, of course. That went all the way back to before the Civil War. There was during slavery, after slavery. A lot of it contributes to why Dr. King really wanted a nonviolent protest. So there was, a lot of information, attention about what was to be said. A lot of people had different inputs on it. A lot of people changed their speeches. John Lewis, of course, was one of those who changed his speech. His speech was a little bit more militant than what was said. And though the members of SNCC had a lot to say about it too, they had their thoughts, but they basically toned it down. They tried to make it as if they toned it down for us, but in actuality, I can kind of get the gist of why they toned it down. They didn't tone it down for us. They toned it down for them, meaning the white races, meaning the violent white races, because we know that it takes nothing for their true colors to come out, and they begin to act like their normal selves, or they allow their cousins or uncles and aunts to act like their normal selves. I mean, they needed the National Guard to escort a 6-year-old to school, and it wasn't because of the kids. Right, exactly. So, and that was the whole neighborhood. It wasn't like it was people who was saying no and this is not right. Yeah, if it was only a few and we didn't see them. But anyway, that's what we're going to talk about today, because Martin Luther King had a lot of words for them. But a fun fact about his speech at the March on Washington, those that were sitting behind him, they felt like he was bombing it, right? Because it's a long march. I think he was the last one to speak. It was sort of all day. They had different, it wasn't just a march, they had march. They had speakers. People were singing. I believe the Jubilee singers sang there. I know Mahalia Jackson sang. Who else? It was some more, but there were a lot of speakers slated to speak. But Mahalia Jackson was sitting down, like right near him, on side of him. And while he was speaking, he said, "Tell him about the dream, Mark." And that's when he goes into, "I had a dream that, one day this, and this," right? But actually, his have a dream, that part of the speech, and that was impromptu, but it was, not sort of rehearsed, but he basically knew it. But that dream actually came from a young SNCC member. I think she was 14 at the time. I cannot remember her name. I will remember it and put it in the show notes. But she told she told MLK about her dream, and that's how it sort of spiraled on from there. It wasn't her words exactly, but it was the idea of the dream came from her. It was her dream. It was something she did dream about, equality and all of that. It's a young kid. She was, I think she could have been 13, 14. She was very young, like maybe middle school age, if not high school, if high school barely. So so that's where the part of the speech, "I have a dream." Now, you probably don't even know what other speeches Martin Luther King has done that he did before that and after that. There's another fact about the speech. When he did give the speech, it didn't sort of what we would call go viral instantly. No, that's not what happened. It actually didn't go viral until a few weeks later, and that was the bombing of the 16th Street Baptist Church in Montgomery. I say Montgomery. I always get Alabama and Mississippi mixed up because they were similar. But I believe it was the 16th Street Church bombing, and that was in Alabama. I'm almost certain about that. But they always talk about the 4 little girls, right? 4 girls that were bombed. That's when that speech actually started to get some traction. It's been a month, maybe about a month. It was weeks after he had gave the speech on Wash. Didn't get a huge stir instantly, but the bombing of the church and the 4 girls that was slaughtered from those white supremacists blowing up that church, and then there was 4 girls died, and there was a 5th girl that was injured. She was permanently blind from that. Her sister passed away. Even after that, there were 2 boys that were murdered in the streets after the bombing because they were mad, upset about what had happened at the church, and they were just going out in the street pissed off, and white supremacists killed them. Let's say one was shot by police, and I want to say the other was shot by white supremacists. The speech that MLK gave, the "I Had a Dream" speech, it really didn't blow up until like 4 weeks after he gave the speech, after the March on Washington. The reason for that was the Birmingham, Alabama 16th Street church bombing. There were 4 girls that was murdered inside the church. There was 1 other girl who was injured. She was permanently blind. And then there was 2 boys that was murdered outside the church in response to it. Denise McNair, Cynthia Wesley, Addie Mae Collins, Carol Robertson. There was the 4 girls that died inside the church. And then Sarah Collins Rudolph, that's the girl that was injured, permanently blind. And then Virgil Ware and Johnny Robbins shot outside of the aftermath of the bombing that same day. And you can read more about this on our website at politicaleducationforfreedom.org/16th. That's the number 168-Street-Church-Birmingham. And that'll take you right to the story. And that's a story for kids too. It's not just for adults. There's some other resources on that story too as well. I believe there may be a lesson plan and some guiding questions for students and or adults. So that was a fact about MLK "I Had a Dream" speech. But today we're going to talk about the dream he had that did make it to the school textbook. Yeah, Dr. King wasn't just about peaceful marches. He had some tough words for the white power structure and even for white allies who just didn't get it. You'll hear now, it was a taboo to talk about white allies before. Now you'll hear it more, a lot with some of the anti-racist scholars or DEI scholars. I don't know what to call them. I really don't like anti-racist, but that's what they've been calling themselves for some time, so whatever, no big deal. But you'll hear them criticizing white allies a lot more than before in the 60s, which Martin Luther King was on the right path, because a lot of what he said, we have to say it now, and that's because either it wasn't said loud enough or those white allies just didn't listen. They probably never even read the damn book. So MLK, he wrote a few books, actually, pretty decent book. I liked the last one, published after he was assassinated. I like Why We Can't Wait. So where do we go from here? Chaos or community? That's a lot of what I'll be reading from today. I'm gonna read you some excerpts, probably play a few excerpts of him and some of his speeches. The where do we go from here? Chaos, community. It's a question, right? The title of the book is actually a question. Well, he answers the question at the end of the book. He gives a detailed plan of what needs to happen towards the very end of the book. So, yeah, that was a question, but he answered in Where Do We Go From Here? He addressed white supremacy in the context of housing, education, and economic mobility. He said, whites, it must frankly be said, are not putting in a similar mass effort to re-educate themselves out of their racial ignorance. It's an aspect of their sense of superiority that white people of America believe they have so little to learn. In this quote, he is highlighting the systemic nature of racial issues in America by pointing out the complacency and the thought process among a lot of white Americans regarding racial inequality. He emphasizes the need for a societal shift in attitude and understanding to address ingrained issues in housing, education, and economics, which of course all were significantly affected by discrimination and white supremacy. In his later years, Dr. King did mince words about white supremacy. He called it out, not just in the South, but everywhere, you name it. He wasn't shy about saying that this wasn't just a quote bad apple problem. It was systemic, deep rooted in America. And he especially talked about it in the book Where Do We Go From Here? Chaos or Community. He addressed specifically white liberals. He talked about the quote unquote white moderate who was more devoted to order than justice, who preferred a negative peace, which is absent of tension, to a quote positive peace, which is the presence of justice. Sound familiar? Yeah, that's just what's going on today. And here's an excerpt from the book Where Do We Go From Here? He says, often white liberals are unaware of their latent prejudice. A while ago, I ran into a white woman who was anxious to discuss the race problem with me. She said, I am very liberal. I have no prejudice towards Negro. I believe Negroes should have the right to vote, the right to a good job, the right to a decent home, and the right to have access to public accommodation. Of course, I must confess that I would not want my daughter to marry a Negro. Dr. King had such grace listening to this woman. Now he said, this lady could not see that her failure to accept intermarriage negated her claim to genuine liberalism. She failed to see that implicit in her rejection was the feeling that her daughter had some pure, superior nature that should not be contaminated by the impure, inferior nature of the Negro. He said it is a Teutonic origin theory warmed over. The question of intermarriage is never raised in a society cured of the disease of racism. Now, isn't that something? Like, that's the whole point of him saying that whites need to re-educate themselves out of their racial ignorance. Like, she can't even, and it quells the notion of it's just that these are just bad apples. No, it quells that. It's not just bad apples. It's systemic. It's all of y'all. It's everybody. Yeah, that is true. It's everybody. Like, unless you have been doing some kind of work in opposition to what your culture has taught you to be like, then yeah, it's you too. It's not, this is not something that is, it's hard because it's ingrained in you to think this way or to think that way, not because you did it, of course, but society created this. And so even though you want to, in your mind, heart, body, or whatever, want to feel or portray or be a normal human being that wants justice and equality for everyone. This system, this country itself, this country specifically, has conditioned your brain to think otherwise. And every part of the society does it. Even black people. We've been trained that way. The difference is that as black people, they teach us to be anti-black towards each other. They don't teach us to be anti-white. So it's what he's calling out right now. You see that a lot. We can see it more, even more now than before. But it just kind of goes to show you, especially in the workplace and stuff, how, you may think you have an ally out there, but even some of the best allies, there is a strong prejudice, biases, racism, anti-blackness that's just ingrained there. We got an uphill battle to fight. One of them is calling out white liberals that see themselves as an ally and fighting for equality and all of that, when in actuality they are in opposition of equality. And Melke addresses that in this same book. He says the white liberal must arm that absolute justice for the Negro simply means, in the Aristotelian sense, that the Negro must have, quote, his due. There is nothing abstract about this. It is as concrete as having a good job, a good education, a decent house, and a share of power. It is, however, important to understand that giving a man his due may often mean giving him special treatment. I am aware of the fact that this has been a troublesome concept for many liberals, since it conflicts with their traditional idea of equal opportunity and equal treatment of people according to their individual merit. We know it don't exist. But this is the day which demand new thinking and the re-evaluation of old concepts. A society that has done something special against the Negro for hundreds of years must now do something special for him in order to equip him to compete on a just and equal basis. That's very simple. I'll go on. The white liberal must rid himself of the notion that there can be a tensionless transition from the old order of injustice to the new order of justice. Two things are clear to me, and I hope they are clear to white liberals. One is that the Negro cannot achieve emancipation through violent rebellion. The other is that the Negro cannot achieve emancipation by passively waiting for the white race to voluntarily grant it to him. The Negro has not gained a single right in America without persistent pressure and agitation. However lamentable it may seem, the Negro is now convinced that the white America will never admit to him equal right unless it is coerced into doing. Nonviolent coercion always brings tension to the surface. This tension, however, must not be seen as destructive. There is a kind of tension that is both healthy and necessary for growth. Society needs nonviolent gadflies to bring its tension into the open and force its citizens to confront the ugliness of their prejudices and the tragedy of their racism. It is important for the liberal to see that the oppressed person who agitates for his right is not the creator of the tension. He merely brings out the hidden tension that is already alive. Last summer, when we had our open housing marches in Chicago, many of our white liberal friends cried out in horror and dismay, "You're creating hatred and hostility in the white communities in which you are marching. You are only developing a white backlash." Boy, that sounds familiar. I never could understand this logic. This is Dr. King speaking. They failed to realize that the hatred and the hostility were already latently or subconsciously present. Our marches merely brought them to the surface. How strange it would be to condemn a physician who, through persistent work and the ingenuity of his medical skills, discovered cancer in a patient. Would anyone be so ignorant as to say he caused the cancer? Through the skills and discipline of direct action, we reveal that there is a dangerous cancer of hatred and racism in our society. We did not cause the cancer. We merely exposed it. Only through this kind of exposure will the cancer ever be cured. The committed white liberal must see the need for powerful antidote to combat the disease of racism. That's done. And yeah, that was in the city. You can believe it. But it's also something that we say today. We have to say today. We have to point out today because they're doing the same thing. King's frustration with white liberals was real. He saw them as folks who would pat you on the back in public but wouldn't stand up when it really mattered. They were all about civil rights as long as it didn't upset their comfortable lives too much. Now, that also brings me to Dr. King's stance on the Vietnam War and the reason he was in Memphis when he was assassinated. His opposition to the Vietnam War marked a significant public shift in his activism. He gave a speech called Beyond Vietnam, and he declared, "A time comes when silence is betrayal." He gave this speech at Riverside Church in New York City on April 4, 1967. The speech was called Beyond Vietnam. He says, "I am convinced that if we are to get on the right side of the world revolution, we as a nation must undergo a radical revolution of value. We must rapidly begin the shift from a thing-oriented society to a person-oriented society. When machines and computers, profit motive, and property rights are considered more important than people, the giant triplets of racism, extreme materialism, and militarism are incapable of being conquered." In that speech, he boldly criticized the United States' involvement in the Vietnam War and also linked the war to issues of social justice, including racism, materialism, militarism. His stance was controversial, and this was because it connected the domestic policies of the U.S. with foreign policies of the U.S. Basically shitted on the fundamentals of American society and capitalism. But we know that's what we do. And stance and his movement started to look to be more global, focusing on foreign policy, on U.S. foreign policy. He was challenging the notion that domestic and foreign policies are separate. He saw the war as an extension of the injustices he fought against at home. It was draining resources and attention from the civil rights movement and the war on poverty. He basically said, "If I stand for justice, I can't ignore this." He also said that he also talked about, and I'm actually going to, and follow up with this episode, I'm going to talk about the Vietnam War and how it intersected with the civil rights movement. It was actually it made a huge difference in the movement and how certain things were accomplished legislatively. I don't think those two things could have happened separately, and we still have the outcomes that we had. I think with the Vietnam War, it actually made the civil rights legislation happen a lot more easier. Also, during the era of the civil rights and the Vietnam War, there was a draft, and young people were being drafted. So that increased the participation in voting because, these young people were being drafted, and they was like, hell no, why the hell are we being drafted? Why are we getting drafted to the war? There's also a lot to look at. There was disparities in the Vietnam War too. Another reason why Dr. King spoke against it, because there were two things at play. One was black people were disproportionately being drafted over white people, even though we were only about 13% of the population. We were being drafted more. The other thing was black people were dying more during the Vietnam War, disproportionate. We're only 13% of the population, yet we were the ones that were dying at a higher rate than white. He's saying, you telling us that we have to go out here and fight another country for quote unquote freedom and democracy, yet we are here and we are not even free and we can't even participate in democracy. But you telling us to go to Vietnam and fight in a war for somebody else's freedom, which I don't even know how we can even, can we even say that was freedom? That's the lie you sell us, that we should go over here to fight for the freedom of these people, yet I'm not even free here. I'm not even free here right now. Then you had veterans that were coming home from Vietnam. There were some veterans that were in World War II with the Nazis, and they were coming home being murdered, killed, mistreated. They didn't even respect black people in the uniform. During the bus boycotts, I believe in Montgomery, a veteran was murdered on the bus. MLK had to address them at some point. So people look at it like, him dabbling into U.S. foreign policy. No, that foreign policy did not just affect people overseas in the countries that we were warring with. It was actually affecting us here at home. I mean, it was affecting specifically black people. And so it was something that eventually would have had to be addressed. And I plan to follow up about just some basic facts about the Vietnam War and how the Vietnam War was necessary for us to achieve that legislation that was during the 60s. Now, of which most of it has been rolled back. Now let's go on to Memphis. So Dr. King was in Memphis for a reason, okay? The purpose of him being there was to support the sanitation workers strike. The workers were protesting inhumane working conditions and racial discrimination. Their slogan, "I am a man," statement of dignity against degrading treatment. This is what Dr. King did. He went to those marches. He was in the trenches. He just didn't give speeches. He went out there and he told people to protest, march, and all of those nonviolent protests. He did it. He didn't just tell people to do it. He also did it because he realized it wasn't just another stop on the civil rights trail. It was about something bigger, and that was economic justice. Dr. King knew that the fight for civil rights was only half the battle. For him, it wasn't enough to just sit at the same lunch counter as white folks if you could afford the meal. It was about more than that. And we also know that, and I think I talked about that a little bit, that we didn't want to we wasn't just sitting up there trying to eat the same lunch counter. The purpose of the nonviolent protest was for something much more greater than just eating on side of white people. There was a book I read and it talked about the emancipated slaves after the Civil War who were asked some questions. And when they came up with the whole Reconstruction plan, he asked the formerly enslaved men and women if they wanted to be in community with white people, if they wanted to live with them. They said no. No, we don't want to be near y'all. We know what y'all do. We know how y'all are. We just want to be over there by ourselves, doing our own thing, building and living and just being regular. 100 years later, really changed. They wasn't asking to sit and be in community with white people. They were just asking to get what was due. That's all. And Dr. King understood that, which is why he went to Memphis. He knew that it was about economic injustice in Memphis. The Memphis sanitation strike began in February of 1968. It was a big deal in the civil rights movement and in the labor rights movement in the United States because the labor unions before, there were laws against black people joining labor unions. Okay, that's one thing. Yeah, weird, huh? And the white people within the labor unions did not want black people to join their union. Stupid, right? You need labor union and everyone has to be a part of it. Here's why. This is what happened when those labor unions exclude black people. What they did was anytime they threatened a strike, they said, okay, all right, strike. And what would happen when they went on strike, they went and hired all the black people who was excluded from joining the labor union, excluded from getting their fair equal pay, excluded all of these things that white people was excluding black people from. It blew up in their face with the labor unions every time. Because what would happen? The damn companies would just say, well, I got somebody who can do the work. Go ahead. Go y'all asses on strike. Matter of fact, stay on it. Because I'm going to pay the Negro here to do the work. And then I'm going to pay him less than what I pay you. So now you potentially out of a job. And then what they would do, of course, is blame the Negro for taking a job. No. First of all, you told me I couldn't join the union. I would have been on the other side with your ass if you would have allowed me to join the union. But you didn't. So now either I have my own union, and then I advocate for us in our way, but it was actually a law in, I want to say it was one of the southern states. It could have been Mississippi, Louisiana, Texas, I don't know. There was a law against black people joining union. Yeah, there was a law against it. And that law kind of goes all the way back to 1871, maybe. I want to say that's how far back that law goes. Because there was a time when, the workers were united, including void of race. They were all united, black and white. And then the power structure came in and said, no, we can't have y'all together. So what they did, they enticed the other side, which was white, to not be in league with the black. And so, they forged the divide. Bam. Now you have unions you had labor unions that were dominated by whites, but were not successful in anything because they could never threaten a strike. And so the strike was initiated by African American sanitation workers after two workers, Echo Cole and Robert Walker, were crushed to death by a malfunctioning garbage truck on February 1st, 1968. So the incident brought to the forefront the poor working conditions, low wages, racial discrimination faced by the sanitation workers, predominantly African American, were subjected to unsafe working environments and, of course, unequal treatment compared to their white counterpart. Their slogan, I am a man, that kind of tells you that these were primarily men, but it was to symbolize their demand for dignity, respect, and fair labor practices. Involvement in supporting Memphis sanitation workers, it was significant because it also showed that he would get down in the trenches. It didn't matter. And even though that's where he was murdered, he often said that he felt like his life was always in danger. So there wasn't a moment where he thought, oh, I better not go here and do this because I could potentially be murdered. No, he went anyway because it was like, if I go anywhere, I could potentially be murdered. The way that they were bombing and blowing up other shit, they did the same to him. He always felt like his life was in danger. I don't doubt if he was in Memphis, if he was in somewhere else, I don't think it would have mattered. They would have killed him anyway. They killed Medgar Evers outside of his home, shot him in the back like a coward. I don't think it made a difference where he would have been at the time. He was fighting for decent living conditions. It was about making sure that Black Americans had the same shot at a good life as everyone else. Now, in his last speech, I've Been to the Mountaintop, he not only addressed the strike, but also broader issues of economic inequality and injustice. He urged support of Black businesses and called for a non-violent march. Dr. King was intertwining his vision with civil rights and economic justice. It was always about economic justice, not just civil rights.
I lived in China or even Russia or any totalitarian country, maybe I could understand some of these illegal injunctions. Maybe I could understand the denial of certain basic First Amendment privileges because they haven't committed themselves to that over there. But somewhere I read of the freedom of assembly. Somewhere I read of the freedom of speech. Somewhere I read of the freedom of press. Somewhere I read that the greatness of America is the right to protest for rights. And so just as I say we aren't going to let any dog or water hoses turn us around, we aren't going to let any injunction turn us around. I don't know what will happen now. We've got some difficult days ahead, but it really doesn't matter with me now because I've been to the mountaintop. To live a long life, longevity has its place. But I'm not concerned about that now. I just want to do God's will. And He's allowed me to go up to the mountain. And I've looked over and I've seen the promised land. I may not get there with you, but I want you to know tonight that we as a people will get to the promised land. So I'm happy tonight. I'm not worried about anything. I'm not fearing any man. Mine eyes have seen the glory of the coming of the Lord.
That was the speech the night before his assassination. From what he said, we know it wasn't just the act of the lone gunman. It was the climax of a society that both overtly and covertly supported white dominance. His death was a wake-up call, but the question is, have we really woken up? His stance on the Vietnam War and his reasons for being in Memphis reveal a leader who was constantly evolving, pushing the boundaries, and showing us what it really means to fight for justice. Now, on the darker side of the chapter is the FBI's surveillance of Dr. King. It wasn't just about keeping tabs on him, but it was a full-blown campaign to undermine him. And the chilling part is they might have had the means to prevent his murder. He was under surveillance by the FBI, kept tabs on him. They also followed him. Also stories of the FBI being just 2 doors away when he was shot. Under J. Edgar Hoover, the FBI saw Dr. King not just as a nuisance, but a threat to the status quo. They wiretapped his phone, bugged his hotel rooms, even tried to discredit him publicly. The level of surveillance, invasive, unethical, frankly, terrifying. If the FBI was so closely monitoring Dr. King, could they just have saw that he was about to be assassinated? I mean, it's a serious thing about how our relationship between our leaders who were assassinated and the state. Like, these times seem like it was 100 years ago, because we know 100 years ago they did, state sanctioned violence was, and we know, of course, with the assassination of Fred Hampton, that was just like clear as day. Yeah. It's weird now to sort of think about how the FBI was keeping so much tabs on him that they knew that he was close to being assassinated and they didn't do much about it. It's almost like they were okay with him being assassinated by, a citizen, so that they don't necessarily have to take the heat. MLK was much bigger on a global scale, so they felt like they could get rid of him, but they felt like somebody else needed to get rid of MLK. That's just my thoughts. That's what I believe, because you can't full-time surveillance on somebody and not know that they is in danger. We don't need to create conspiracies about other black leaders and their involvement with MLK assassination. No, we have enough of conspiracy theories dealing with the government and white people, white elected leaders, white powerful leaders who were running the damn government, who was running the damn FBI. Why y'all gotta bring everybody else in? Like, can we deal with this one first? Like, I don't even want to think about the other ones. I haven't even dealt with the white ones. Can we just deal with the white ones first? There was a resolve, like a clear-eyed vision of what was at stake. And he wasn't just addressing the crowd in Memphis. He was speaking to the future generations and standing up against injustice. Was King at his most militant and for direct action, not just word. I am going to follow-up episode. I'm going to discuss McCarthyism, because that had a lot to do with the way the FBI targeted MLK by using McCarthyism. It wasn't just him. There were a few other black revolutionary fighters in the fight for equality and justice for black people was targeted in the era of McCarthyism. And I'll talk about that. You also heard in the clip of his speech where he talks about getting to the promised land. It's like he knew he would make it, but he was reassuring us that the journey doesn't end with him. That baton he passed to us. Keep marching towards that promised land of justice and equality. This speech is a stark reminder that Dr. King's fight wasn't just against segregation, it was against the entire system of oppression. He was challenging us to see the bigger picture, to understand that the struggle is long, but the goal is worth every step. As we honor Dr. King today, let's not sanitize his legacy. Let's not just freeze him in 1963 with the I Have a Dream speech. Let's remember him on that mountaintop in Memphis, staring into the future, challenging us to carry on the fight. Remember Dr. King's legacy and the FBI's role in his life. Let's also think about the broader implications. How do we ensure that the fight for justice doesn't get undermined by the very institutions meant to protect us? We've been dealing with that for our entire existence here. How do we guard against a repeat of history in any form? Think about it. Dr. King wasn't just a dreamer. He was a fighter against the very foundations of white supremacy and the complacency of white liberals. And that fight, my friend, is far from over. Thanks for tuning in to this special MLK Day edition of Political Education for Freedom podcast. I'm Nitra, and I challenge you to think about Dr. King's unvarnished truth and what it means in our world today, reminding you to keep climbing towards that mountaintop. It's what Dr. King fought for, and it's what we're still fighting for. The struggle for freedom is is never really over. Remember to look beyond the surface of history and to understand the depth and breadth of the struggle we continue today. Keep learning, keep fighting, and keep Dr. King's real dream alive.
Reverend Martin Luther King Jr. was shot to death by an assassin late today as he stood on a balcony in Memphis, Tennessee. Dr. King had planned to lead another civil rights march in Memphis.
With the problems that men have been trying to grapple with through history, but the demands didn't force them to do it. Survival demands that we grapple with it. Men for years now have been talking about war and peace, but now no longer can they just talk about it. It is no longer the choice between violence and non-violence in this world. It's non-violence or non-existence. That is where we are today. In the human rights revolution, if something isn't done and done in a hurry to bring the colored peoples of the world out of their long years of poverty, their long years of hurt and neglect, the whole world is doomed. Happy that God has allowed me to live in this period, to see what is unfolding. And I'm happy that he's allowed me to be in Memphis. I can remember when Negroes were just going around, as Ralph has said, so often scratching where they didn't itch and laughing when they were not tickled. But that day is all over. We mean business now, and we are determined to gain our rightful place in God's world. We aren't engaged in any negative protest and in any negative arguments with anybody. We are saying that we are determined to be men. We are determined to be people. We are saying that we are God's children. And if we are God's children, we don't have to live like we are forced to live. Now, what does all of this mean in this great period of history? It means that we've got to stay together. We've got to stay together and maintain unity. You know, whenever Pharaoh wanted to prolong the period of slavery in Egypt, he had a favorite formula for doing it. What was that? He kept the slaves fighting among themselves. I am happy to join with you today in what will go down in history as the greatest demonstration for freedom in the history of our nation. I still have a dream. It is a dream deeply rooted in the American dream. I have a dream that one day this nation will rise up, live out the true meaning of its creed. I have a dream that one day even the state of Mississippi, a state sweltering with the heat of injustice, sweltering with the heat of oppression, will be transformed into an oasis of freedom and justice. I have a dream. I have a dream that one day, down in Alabama, with its vicious racists, with its governor having his lips dripping with the words of interposition and nullification. One day right there in Alabama, little black boys and black girls will be able to join hands with little white boys and white girls as sisters and brothers. I have a dream today. I have a dream that one day every valley shall be exalted. Every hill and mountain shall be made low, the rough places will be made plain, and the crooked places will be made straight, and the glory of the Lord shall be revealed, and all flesh shall see it together. This is our hope. This is a faith that I go back to the South with. With this faith, we will be able to hew out of the mountain of despair a stone of hope. With this faith, we will be able to transform the jangling discords of our nation into a beautiful symphony of brotherhood. With this faith, we will be able to work together, to pray together, to struggle together, to go to jail together, to stand up for freedom together, knowing that we will be free one day. When we allow freedom ring, when we let it ring from every village and every hamlet, from every state and every city, we will be able to speed up that day when all of God's children, black men and white men, Jews and Gentiles, Protestants and Catholics, will be able to join hands and sing in the words of the old Negro spiritual, free at last, free at last, thank God Almighty, we are free at last.
Of striking garbage collectors. Police used riot control gas and nightsticks this afternoon to break up a disturbance among a group of striking garbage men. Part of a group of about 1,000 marchers began rocking a police car, and police waded in.
Anybody who runs around picking on peaceful people is building for trouble.
We probably cannot expect protection of Negro people from brutality and from repression locally. The ear and the power outside of the city of Memphis.
Dr. Martin Luther King has urged the Memphis Negro community to engage in a general work stoppage and school boycott in support of the city's striking sanitation workers.
So I come to commend you, and I come also to say to you that in this struggle you have the absolute support, and that means financial support also of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. All over America, the vast majority of Negroes in our country are still perishing on a lonely island of poverty in the midst of a vast ocean of material prosperity. And it is criminal to have people working a full-time job getting part-time income.
If the men do not return to work immediately, we will have no choice but to employ others to protect the public health.
This is Ray Sherman on the scene. Several thousand Negro demonstrators are participating in this largest civil rights demonstration ever in Memphis, Tennessee. This massive downtown march on Memphis is now underway. Several thousand Negroes are marching toward City Hall at this time. Many of the demonstrators are carrying the sign, "I am a man." They stretch out for several blocks. Later today, as the march moves up toward City Hall, Dr. Martin Luther King will speak to the striking workers and their sympathizers, now estimated somewhere between 5,000 and 8,000. Police are on hand with about 600 officers. Almost the entire force is standing by here in case any trouble might break out. Chaos has just broken out downtown. All right. Negro youths are smashing windows. I just saw. That sound you just heard was the sound of a tear gas fired by a police officer in an attempt to thwart this unruly demonstration. We repeat, several Negro youths started running down Main Street, smashing windows as they ran. Police are now moving down Beale Street. The tear gas is boiling up from the street, and the Negro youths are fleeing from the area. Police
police are scrambling down Beale Street now. There's been a call of help from other officers. Officers are in trouble. The Negro youths are shouting at this time, "Go, go, go." Police have formed a cordon, and they're not permitting the march to move any further at this point. They're moving in with riot guns and tear gas.
You obviously had a group of boys who were ready to do that, and they did it. They didn't come to the march. They didn't consult us. They're outside of our control, absolutely, always have been. And this time they got their chance to break loose, and they took it.
What happened with Dr. King?
Well, we surrounded him with some ministers and moved him out of the area.
At an undisclosed location.
That nonviolence is the way, and that violence is not the answer.
That mean there will be no more violence in Memphis?
Well, I can't guarantee that there will be no more violence after we leave and go to Washington. I'm simply saying that we are going to have a nonviolent demonstration here.
Dr. King, what are your
plans?
I will be leaving Memphis later today, going back to Atlanta, and my next step would be to come back to Memphis, and that, we hope, can take place in the next 2 or 3 days. We've got to give ourselves to this struggle until the end. Nothing would be more tragic than to stop at this point in Memphis. I want to thank God once more for allowing me to be here with you. I left Atlanta this morning and then I got into Memphis. And some began to say the threats, or talk about the threats that were out. What would happen to me from some of our sick white brother? Well, I don't know what will happen now. We've got some difficult days ahead. Worried about anything. I'm not fearing any man. Mine eyes have seen the glory.
He has been shot at the Lorraine. Suspecting he has been shot.
Memphis police report they have just confirmed that Reverend Martin Luther King has been shot.
getting ready to go to dinner? I was going to my house for dinner, as a matter of fact.
And so I said, Doc, you ready to go? He said, yes, just to say, let's get ready to go right now.
You know, we heard what sounded just like a firecracker, a loud, real loud shot.
I said, Dr. King. That was it. And the bullet exploded in his face.
And he had fallen backwards. And I heard somebody holler, "Oh, Lord."
The bullet knocked him up off of his feet in that direction against that ledger over there.
Did Dr. King say anything?
He didn't say anything. He didn't say anything at all.
It's a hectic scene tonight. A bullet struck Dr. King in the back of the neck. He was rushed to St. Joseph Hospital in critical condition.
Well, I just was told that he had been shot. The report I got was in the shoulder. It was serious. That was the report I got from Reverend Andrew Young.
The pathology and the sickness and the neurosis of Memphis and of this racist society in which we live is that really pulled the trigger. To some extent, Dr. King has been a buffer the last few years between the black community and the white community. The white people do not know it, but the white people's best friend is dead.